this year, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and we're going to be talking today about doing it for the children, which seems to be a very common theme right now in both social media as well as Idaho's legacy media when it comes to legislative issues. For instance, we'll jump right in with an issue about student IDs not being sufficient for voting. Check this out. Proposed legislation would prohibit the use of student IDs at Idaho voting polls. Now, you know, this is part and parcel of a lot of people having misgivings about how easy it is to game the system, whether it's ballot harvesting or whether it's, the perennial joke of the dead vote in Chicago or so forth. But the bottom line is we want to make sure that there is integrity in the voting system. And one of the things we want to make sure is that people aren't casting more than one vote. That is really the crux of what we mean by voter integrity. A person who votes, number one, should be eligible to vote, meaning that they're actually a citizen or they have the civic right to vote, but also that they're doing it correctly and it's not being gamed. Okay, activism takes a lot of different shapes and forms, but one of the most common forms of activism is gaming the system. I'm so smart, I can figure out how to use the system against itself. So when you see proposed legislation prohibiting the use of student IDs at Idaho voting polls, contrary to the knee-jerk reaction that many members of Idaho's legacy media have had, which, this must be some example of they just want to silence these young voices. They just want to make sure that young people, particularly young people who are either fresh out of the public indoctrination centers or attending the higher education or higher indoctrination centers, basically are having their voices heard. It's very important for some reason we get as many of them to vote as possible. So let's make sure that it's being done correctly. Now, if we take a look at some of the actual gist of why this is being proposed, student ID cards would no longer be a valid form of identification at the polls under legislation that was proposed earlier this week. Now, it would also remove the option to sign an affidavit instead of showing photo ID. Now, some people may have a little bit of a misgiving about, well, why should we show photo ID? I'm not a fan of your ID being a government-granted privilege. But again, if you want to make it harder for people to game the system, in fact, I'll use the word cheat, even though that makes me, I'm sure, an election denier in some people's eyes. This is one of the ways you do it. You make sure that the person showing up is providing sufficient information and sufficient verification that they're who they actually say they are. Representative Tina Lambert of Caldwell proposed a bill in the House State Affairs Committee that would remove the student ID card as an acceptable form of voter identification. And the concern here simply comes down to out-of-state students coming across the state lines and voting. By the way, the committee on Monday voted unanimously to introduce the legislation. That in no way means that it's a slunk, but this is just one less way that the system can be gamed, one less way for people to cheat. And I know the common spin is, well, they're making it harder for people to vote. No, they're actually making it harder for people to cheat. Now, places where this has been shouted down and where it's not allowed, Georgia comes to mind, actually even Arizona in this last election. Do you see the controversy that came up, how long it took to count all the votes until we finally got, an acceptable result versus, say, Florida, which used you have to show up in person to vote. You have to show up with a photo ID and not just a student ID card. And who had more contention about how their elections went? I'll tell you this, it wasn't Florida. And it's because they made it harder for people to cheat. Now, that may sound like a terrible thing to say. Why would you make it harder to cheat? Well, look, if voting really is the high sacrament of our civic religion, then let's do what we can to make sure that we're keeping it sacred and not just, making a mockery of it or blaspheming, if you will, by allowing just anybody to come in and cast a vote. Now, this is true, with the idea of limiting primaries, not having ranked choice voting. There's so much effort right now we just want to get enough votes because within those numbers is the illusion of legitimacy. If enough people voted for it, we have to presume, well, it must be right, or this is what people want. But if people are able to game the system, No, it may just be the result of a popularity contest that somebody was able to game to their advantage. And when those popularity contests start to endorse or even put forth policies that conflict with our natural rights, that's a problem. Because your natural rights, do I dare say your God-given rights, don't go away just because a majority of people say, we don't want you to have that right. We'll actually be talking more about that coming up in just a few moments. So let's move on. Here's another bill that's causing some tongues to wag within the legacy media. A bill introduced in the House Judiciary Rules and Administration Committee on Tuesday would make it illegal to provide Idaho minors with medical treatments for gender dysphoria. This is a disingenuous headline. How do we know this? Because it's not, making medical treatment off limits. You know what it is doing? It's putting the brakes on the idea that any kid who has gender confusion or a boy who plays with dolls or whose favorite color is pink cannot be easily steered into what is becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry that we euphemistically refer to as gender-affirming care. But what it's really doing is it is mutilating, either through hormone therapy or through binders or through actual, surgical mutilation of that young person's body to try to help them come to grips with something that may not be a permanent part of who they are. So this legislation is not about we're denying, health care to transgenders. I know that's framing it as hatefully as possible. Well, that's exactly what it's doing. What this is doing is putting the brakes on steering minors into things that cannot be easily reversed, if reversed at all. How do we know that this is the case? Well, funny you should ask. Tonight, there is a young lady who will be speaking at Valley Church in Caldwell, and her name is Chloe Cole. This is a young woman who, when she was, I believe, 14 years old, identified as transgender. She wanted to transition and become a boy. And a couple of years after having the transition done and having actual surgery, meaning they removed body parts to make her appear more like a boy, Chloe came to the realization that that wasn't what she wanted after all. In other words, it was a phase. It was not an essential part of who she was. And she said, okay, how do I go back to being a girl? She since has transitioned back to being a girl. But again, surgery was done. And we're talking irreversible surgery. You don't just, you don't just undo a double mastectomy. It doesn't happen like that. She's speaking out on her experience. And look, I'm not telling you, you don't have to take my word for anything, but I would ask you, as someone where Chloe is someone who has been through the process, you should probably hear what she has to say. And I'm just asking you to consider, maybe she is calling for caution on the part of other minors who thought that they were, in a situation that could only be fixed either through surgery or through hormone replacement or, through counseling and transitioning into, another identity. She can speak from personal experience what it's like to have stood in their shoes. And she cautions, the adults who seize on this and who steer children into it are actually doing more harm down the road. I'm trying to remember, I think it was Sweden. Sweden is always kind of let out in terms of, sex change operations and so forth, back when we called them sex change operations. But I believe Sweden has done one of the most comprehensive studies over the years since they were, the pioneers in sex change operations. They have studied how many people after transitioning, in other words, surgically making the transition from one sex to what they would consider another sex, how many people ended up killing themselves. The numbers are astronomical. I mean, we're talking like somewhere in the neighborhood of 60%. Now that's not anything to gloat over or to minimize as well. It's too bad they were so mixed up. That is a tragedy in every sense of the word. The point here is, do not allow adults, even well-meaning adults, but especially predatory adults, to steer young children into the kind of decisions that are not reversible or that may amount to part of a phase that they are going through. I still think that there's a very worthwhile angle to explore on this, in that many of the people who feel the need to transition into another gender have some kind of unresolved trauma in their lives. And I say this from having heard a couple of people who actually went through that, had the gender dysphoria, actually, were considered themselves ready to become the opposite sex. And then they received therapy for a trauma that had happened to them. In the case of one woman, she had been sexually molested when she was a young girl. In the case of a man who had gone through this, his grandmother dressed him and mentally abused him. She made him dress as a girl and told him how pretty he was. And when that trauma had been addressed, guess what went away? The gender dysphoria went away as well. So it's amazing that Chloe Cole is coming to speak. Again, that's tonight at 7 p.m. My understanding is seating is kind of limited, so if you don't get the chance to attend that, here's something that you can check out. Tomorrow, she will be speaking for Capital Clarity, sponsored by the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and she will be talking about protecting children from the transgender agenda. She'll appear along with Representative Bruce Skog. This will be noon tomorrow in the Lincoln Auditorium at the Idaho Capitol. My understanding is that will be streamed. And if you go to idahofreedom.org, I think you'll find the information necessary to let you see what's happening there and hear her message. Again, I'm not saying you have to agree with her. Maybe you'll still find yourself, totally on the side of, well, this is just unconscionable that we would not indulge whatever these kids going through this gender confusion are asking for. But I think it's far wiser to put the brakes on it, and yes, even legally put the brakes on it, and say once they reach the age of 18, once they are in a position to start accepting responsibility for their own decisions, if that's what they want to do, they should be free to do so. They should also be free to pay for that themselves, or secure the insurance necessary to pay for that. It's not something that needs to be supported or paid for by other people in the sense that you have to dig into your wallet because, well, a kid asked for it. Let's not push kids into something that is irreversible, and let's certainly not play upon that confusion for the sake of making a lot of money. I know that's a pretty bold assertion to make. How can you say these people that are offering this gender affirming care, be seen as just looking after their own self-interest? But it's gone from kind of an oddity and sort of an anomaly among medical circles to it's a full-blown multi-billion-dollar industry. I'm sorry, but the medical establishment has taught us a lot of different things over the last few years. Follow the money, probably one of the most important lessons yet. Moving on to our next story, AR-15s and feminism, why some are raising a flag on an Idaho lawmaker's children's books. This is Senator Brian Lenney. And I got to give him credit. He could not have paid for better advertising than to have the Idaho Press do this story. But the thing I want you to look at here, I'm not telling you need to go out and buy his books. Maybe kids should be learning about AR-15s. Maybe his book on feminism is something that you would find offensive. But what's interesting is the people who are rising up to say, well, we need to protect young minds from ideas that could be seen as dangerous. Here's what I'm talking about. The article goes on to tell us one Idaho lawmaker has taken to children's books to address topics like AR-15s and feminism, and has caused some people to raise an eyebrow. By the way, that's a clue that you and I should raise an eyebrow too, at least in the way that this story is reported. The books, Why Everyone Needs an AR-15, A Guide for Kids, and Why Is Feminism So Silly, A Guide for Kids, were written in 2018 by Senator Brian Lenney. Now, they're available for purchase on Amazon. They each have a 3.5-star rating. So here's Why Is Feminism So Silly, A Guide for Kids. I mean, I know some people will think, what a hateful thing to say, but this actually looks like fun. And if he can make sense of a topic that can become kind of muddled and combative, I say more power to him. Here's the AR-15 book, Why Everyone Needs an AR-15. Now, I get it. Some people are going to look at this and just think, well, this is knee-jerk conservatism, red meat throwing at its finest. But if you actually look at the books, even his critics are saying, there's some pretty good factual information in here. But their big concern is, well, these are pretty young minds. Are we sure that we want to introduce those minds to things that they may not have the power to really comprehend fully? I'm sorry, I just need to let that sink in for a moment, because many of the people who are raising an eyebrow over this are the same people who are like, oh yeah, it's totally okay to have, books available to these kids, young kids, about, different deviant sexual practices and gender identity stuff that, it may be way beyond their comprehension. Somehow, that concern doesn't seem to come through, but boy, if it's something that involves either freedom or the rejection of identity politics, Yeah, they definitely have some heartburn over that. So the article tells us the description for the book reads, in this super fun book for kids, we'll walk you through how awesome the AR-15 is, how it can be used for good, and why the gun-grabbing lefties should focus on something more productive. Now, I know those words are going to seem like fighting words to some people, but there's also a lot of truth in this. And anybody who's taken firearms training can understand that the AR-15, whatever it is not just a merciless killing machine that goes out and murders mass numbers of people, because it has no conscience. Actually, it does have no conscience. It requires on the conscience of whoever happens to be wielding it. And the vast majority of people who prefer the AR-15 are good people. You get training, you can understand these things. But here we go. Not everyone is convinced that this book is appropriate for children. And I want you to hear how we frame this particular person speaking out on it. Former Senator Patty Ann Lodge, an outspoken gun owner and former school librarian of 35 years, said that she would not carry either of Lenney's books in her libraries. Why? Not enough sex toys in the storyline, or not enough, embrace of diversity, or for that matter, deviancy? I guess we'll see. But it's interesting that we have to be told, well, she's an outspoken gun owner. Yeah, in what regard? In regard for common sense, or gun control, or are we talking something else? Lodge says, it was written as a kid's book, but it's actually for adults, I think. I just think you have to be very careful in what you put into the minds of young children. You think? And these books were written as cartoons or information for older people. Okay, again, would that same mentality hold sway if this was a book about how to engage in same-sex relations? Because there are books that are written specifically for kids, with illustrations, with the whole 9 yards. Why don't we hear those same voices, saying, well, and we need to be careful what we're putting into these young minds? It's a little bit of it's a lot of a double standard. I mean, we can't accuse them of not having standards, but we can say these are double standards. One of Lodge's biggest concerns with the book, which she said does have good facts in it, is how AR-15s are presented. In the book, Lenney talks about how AR-15s can come in any color that you want, that they're fun because of how customizable they are. He uses the phrase, it's like a Lego toy for adults. And Lodge says, I'm going, gosh, the way kids love Legos and put things together, they would think it was a toy. That's a bit of a stretch. Now, listen, as a gun owner and someone who is actually a very unapologetic supporter of the right to keep and bear arms, many times I have heard people refer to the AR-15 as Legos for adults. And it's because they're so modular. They're so customizable. You can put together exactly what you want in the caliber, the configuration, the size, the color. It's truly a remarkable rifle, and it works. I mean, you can actually put it together yourself. You don't have to go have somebody build it for you. Plenty of YouTube videos, or at least there used to be, that you could just sit and learn how to put all the parts together and really, truly roll your own AR-15. But again, is that really what Senator Lenney was trying to do, is trying to break down this wall of, hey, kids, look, this is just another fun toy. You should pick it up and point it at people? Hardly. There is a safety message in here, but there's also a message of these firearms have a place in civilized society. And in the hands of a good person, they are actually a force for good. There's nothing wrong with that message. But, straining at this gnat of, my kids might think it's a toy. By the way, Dr. Jamie Derrick, professor of psychology and communication at University of Idaho, thinks that's the biggest takeaway as well. They make it seem like it's a toy and it's fun and it's colorful. Well, look, not to belabor the point, but shooting AR-15s is fun. It really is. And part of the fun comes from you can customize your own, and it's uniquely yours. And it's fun to have friends shoot it. It's fun to have the kids shoot it. It's not a hard-kicking rifle. It's something that's very easily, adapted to, and they can learn safety, and they can learn marksmanship, proper gun handling, all of that. But Derrick says a child developmentally will not be able to understand that as an analogy, because that's the place where they're not cognitively capable of pulling that information out. And again, I have to ask, where's this same concern when it comes to teaching them about sexual behaviors? I mean, I know we're supposed to believe, and television has trained us now for many generations that, hey, come on, man, sex is consequence free. I mean, come on, every episode of Friends that you used to watch, I mean, come on, uh, the characters were constantly, hooking up with somebody, and no consequences. Maybe there's a breakup, but it's just, I'm just enjoying the good life, and the goal here is to just sleep with as many people as possible. Now, grown-ups in the real world understand the sexual drive is pretty powerful, and sometimes used inappropriately, it can become fixated on some very unhealthy things. And also, there's an emotional side that goes with the exercise of those appetites that is not so easily explained. But if you've ever seen, a person whose heart has been broken because of engaging in certain types of behavior, or because someone they love betrayed them and engaged in certain types of behavior. Okay, all I'm saying is it's not the free-for-all that some people want to make it out to be. So when we hear this caution, well, these minds, these young kids, they're not really able to distinguish this stuff. Exactly. Which is why we don't need to be indoctrinating them into the latest, rainbow mafia ideology. They're going to be exposed to it. Why is there such an emphasis on trying to introduce them to it at such a young age as possible? Moving on here. Derek says, yes, she's concerned about the guns being treated as toys. Now, and she's also concerned, this is also a concern she expressed about the feminism book. She says, adults are responsible for socializing their children in a safe and healthy way, while also letting them be curious about the things they're curious about. Thank you. As a parent, if nobody had told me that, I never would have figured that out. Okay, sarcasm off. She said, children are easily misled, especially by visual appearances. You mean like rainbow, fun-colored stuff, men in drag, dancing around, that kind of thing? No? Oh, something different? Because of that, she says parents should support them by creating learning environments that take into account their cognitive development levels. Often that can mean screening content for them before they consume it. Okay, that sounds like pretty sound advice, actually. But I think it should apply to, things of a sexual nature as well, particularly things that are being provided to them or being offered to them in their school library. I'm just saying, if you're going to show this kind of concern, well, they might see guns and think that this is some way to be irresponsible. How do you think they would behave if you're teaching them deviant behavior and they're being told, embrace this? It's who you are. No, deviant behavior is what you do. It's not who you are. Just in terms of the amount of content that's dedicated to being safe versus framing them, meaning the gun is colorful and toy-like, it's not a strong message, according to Derek, in terms of the number of words dedicated to it. So I don't know. And as a child, which message are you going to be more likely to pick up on and integrate? It's not a book about safety. It's a book about how interesting and fun these weapons are. Now, again, I'm sorry to be jumping back and forth, but when you show kids things that titillate and that otherwise would arouse their curiosity or engage them, to start exploring their sexuality, how is that any less dangerous? It's like that's a switch. Once it is flipped on, it can be very difficult to switch it back off. In fact, I don't know that you can switch it back off. It's hardwired into us. So if you're going to preach caution for one thing, be consistent and understand why people legitimately have concerns about breaking down boundaries and throwing caution to the wind on some of those other things. All right, moving on. The Education Freedom Act will be printed and given a bill number. School choice is slowly moving forward. The process is slow, but it's happening. Thank you, Brian Ullman, for sharing this tweet. Senator Tammy Nichols has introduced this bill, which will fund students and their families and allow them to steer some of that taxpayer money in a direction of their choosing that is most conducive to that child's education. Now, of course, this is going to cause a pretty fair amount of consternation on the part of the public school establishment, and particularly those on the left who really see it as kind of an education camp for kids that ought not be interfered with. Okay, you can have choice, but only within the system that we control absolutely. And it's funny, watching some of the different ways that they're casting about, there's appeals to, the envy. Well, this is only going to benefit the well-to-do. This is only going to benefit people who we don't like. And in fact, you have to see this. This was a tweet that went out recently attacking Scott Herndon. Actually, here, I've got to back up here. This is the first tweet that went out. Herndon would get around $50,000 a year under this education savings account. It's a grift, bud. Grift being a term for anybody who is utilizing funds that I don't approve of. Anybody who's making a living who I haven't given my approval to. But strangely, grift never applies to those who are working for the state, not creating value, but simply collecting whatever funds they can through coercive means. But that's another story for another time. So this tweeter says, by the vendors and private school people who had so much to gain, all without lowering their prices. In other words, it's all about making them rich. Ain't any indoctrination, just people convincing you you're sick and only they have the cure. Now, because he called out Scott Herndon, I thought this was wonderful. Herndon points out, hey, Senator Herndon, that is, says, 3 of my 7 kids are adults, and for the remaining 4, I personally would not use ESAs because we don't need them. And the capper is not everyone wants to use every government program that is available. He's right. That's a marvelous turnaround and a very good way of putting the doubters in their place. I know Herndon is kind of a special target right now, and I got to say, I had not heard of this guy before this legislative session, or at least I hadn't really followed him very closely. But this is a person who appears very committed, principled, and utterly unafraid of all the bromides and the angst and anger that is being directed at him, either through the Twitter sphere or through the legacy media. So, kudos to Scott Herndon for standing up and being counted. And, I don't know, will school choice go through? Utah just passed it. That was interesting. By the way, Utah also just passed a very similar bill to the prohibition on gender surgeries for minors. And of course, the Salt Lake Tribune, in true liberal fashion, had to portray it as, well, it's the biggest school voucher thing ever. It's not vouchers. They too have, I think they're called scholarships, but opponents will call them vouchers. And of course, they're denying health care to transgenders. It's spin. And look, the state isn't always the answer to all of our problems, but there are times where it does need to be applied judiciously. This may be one of those times. So I hope to see the school choice bill move forward. It'd be nice to see people have choice. And keep in mind, there are people who are perfectly happy and content and will continue to patronize the public or government-run school system. But the level of threat that is seen by some within that system, particularly teachers' unions and people who are pushing a leftist ideology, seems very disproportionate to the actual threat at hand. Do they worry that people are going to run for the doors if they're given the opportunity? And if so, why would they run for the doors? Is it maybe because they just don't want to risk their kids being indoctrinated into, it's okay, there's boys in the girls' locker room and girls in the boys' locker room, and everything's a free-for-all. Oh, and we don't talk about guns. We can't ever mention guns. Why? Anything like that would just be wrong. After all, we're doing this for the children. They're your kids. Don't ever forget that. No teacher, no administrator, not even a legislator, no functionary has more authority over those kids than you do. And with that comes the corresponding responsibility and stewardship that you have with God. So do a good job as a parent. It's going to frustrate some of those people who really want to, groom your kid into a nice little leftist. But having done your part, your kids will make the right decisions when they get older, even if they do find themselves curious or sometimes seduced by that siren song of left-wing ideology. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.